The silence in the Senate Judiciary Committee room was a physical thing, a heavy blanket woven from anticipation and stale, recycled air. It was the kind of quiet that precedes an execution. Then Adam Schiff spoke, and the silence shattered. His voice, usually a carefully modulated instrument of political theater, was raw, stripped of its usual polish. "With all due respect, Senator," he began, the words dripping with a contempt that nullified the courtesy, "your capacity for indignation is matched only by your willful ignorance." He leaned into his microphone, the leather of his chair groaning in protest. Across the dais, Senator John Kennedy watched him, his expression unreadable behind the simple wire-rimmed glasses that had become his trademark. Kennedy's hands were steepled before him, his fingertips touching lightly, the picture of academic repose. He hadn't moved a muscle. He hadn't blinked. The hearing, a supposedly routine examination of the FBI's domestic surveillance programs, had been crawling along for 2 hours, a desert of bureaucratic jargon and procedural minutiae. Reporters in the press gallery were fighting off sleep, their laptops filled with half-formed sentences about budgetary constraints and oversight protocols. Then, Schiff had taken the floor, and a jolt of electricity had shot through the room. He wasn't addressing the FBI director. He was addressing Kennedy. "You come here," Schiff continued, his voice rising, a tremor of fury entering his tone, "and you lecture this committee on constitutional principles. You, a man who has made a career of peddling folksy wisdom that insults the intelligence of the American people. A man who treats this sacred chamber like a stage for his one-man vaudeville act." In the gallery, a ripple of murmurs spread. Schiff's supporters, seated on the left, began to applaud, a scattered patter that grew into a confident ovation. A young staffer in the front row pumped his fist. "Give it to him, Adam," he mouthed silently. Kennedy remained still. He slowly reached for a glass of water, his movements economical and precise. He took a small, measured sip, his eyes never leaving Schiff's face. The gesture was infuriatingly calm, a deliberate counterpoint to Schiff's theatrical rage. It was the calm of a man who knows the outcome of a game before it has even begun. Schiff saw the placid smile playing at the corners of Kennedy's mouth, and it was like gasoline on a fire. He slammed his open palm down on the mahogany table. The sound was a flat, ugly crack that made the microphones jump. "You defended a corrupt president. You stood by while he tore down the very institutions we are sworn to protect. You parroted conspiracy theories cooked up in the darkest corners of the internet and gave them the imprimatur of a United States senator." The veins in Schiff's neck stood out like cords. A fine sheen of sweat had appeared on his upper lip, catching the cold, unforgiving glare of the overhead lights. He was a man consumed by his own righteous fire, his body trembling with the force of his convictions. In the front row, a woman named Elena Petrova watched, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. She was a naturalized citizen, a small business owner from Baton Rouge who had received a personal invitation from Senator Kennedy's office. Pinned to her simple blue dress was a small laminated card bearing the photograph of her father, a journalist who had been imprisoned in the old Soviet Union for printing the truth. She had come to Washington to see American democracy in action. She had not expected this raw, naked hatred. Republican senators exchanged uneasy glances. This was far beyond the usual partisan sparring. This was a vendetta unfolding on live television. The Democratic senators, however, looked invigorated, leaning forward, some nodding in encouragement. They saw a champion landing blows, a fighter taking the battle to the enemy. The press corps was suddenly wide awake, a frenzy of typing filling the air, as 40 reporters simultaneously realized that the real story of the day had just begun. This was the soundbite. This was the clip that would lead the evening news. Kennedy carefully placed his water glass back on its coaster, ensuring it was perfectly centered. He then reached into his jacket and produced a simple, folded handkerchief. With the same infuriating deliberation, he removed his glasses and began to polish the lenses, his movements slow and circular. The entire room, the roaring supporters, the frantic reporters, the uncomfortable senators, all seemed to hold their breath, their attention fixed on this small, quiet act of maintenance. It was a masterful piece of political stagecraft, a silent assertion of dominance. "Are you finished, Senator Schiff?" Kennedy's voice, when it finally came, was soft, his Louisiana drawl thick and unhurried. The question was not an interruption. It was a dismissal. It suggested that Schiff's tirade was little more than a childish tantrum that had finally exhausted itself. The shift in power was palpable. The air in the room seemed to cool by several degrees. Schiff, who had been riding a wave of his own fury, was momentarily thrown off balance. "I haven't even begun to describe the damage you have done to this country," he stammered, his momentum broken. "That's a shame," Kennedy said, his voice still gentle, yet carrying an undertone of pure steel. "Because, while you've been speaking, I've been thinking, and I have a question for you." He replaced his glasses, settling them carefully on the bridge of his nose. He let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room. Even Schiff's most ardent supporters were quiet now, a sense of unease creeping into their expressions. They had come for a public flogging, but they were beginning to suspect they had misidentified the victim. Kennedy's hand moved across the table and came to rest on a thick, dark blue binder. The binder was unmarked, but its thickness suggested a wealth of information. The red classified stamps that peeked out from the edges of the pages within were visible even from the back of the gallery. Schiff's eyes, which had been blazing with anger just moments before, narrowed slightly. It was a flicker of apprehension, almost imperceptible, but the C-SPAN cameras zoomed in tight, captured it perfectly. "You told the American people," Kennedy began, his voice dropping to an almost conversational tone, yet it carried to every corner of the chamber, "that you had seen the evidence. You said it on television. You said it in interviews. You wrote it in op-eds. You swore that you, as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, had proof of a criminal conspiracy." He paused, looking directly at Schiff. "My question, Senator, is simple. Where is it?" Schiff's mouth opened and closed. A small muscle in his jaw began to twitch. "That investigation is closed. The evidence is classified. You know I cannot discuss classified intelligence in an open hearing." His voice was defensive, a retreat from the aggressive certainty of moments before. "Cannot?" Kennedy repeated the word, savoring it. "Or will not? Or perhaps," he leaned forward, his folksy demeanor vanishing, replaced by the sharp focus of a prosecutor. "It never existed at all." The accusation hung in the air, stark and brutal. The silence that followed was absolute, a crushing weight that seemed to suck the very oxygen from the room. The narrative had been flipped. The hunter had become the hunted. Chairman Lindsey Graham, who had been poised to gavel down Schiff's outburst, now sat back in his chair, his expression a mixture of caution and intense curiosity. He was letting the drama play out. Schiff scrambled to regain his footing, his face flushed with a new, more desperate anger. "This is an outrageous accusation, a baseless smear. I conducted my constitutional duty to hold a corrupt administration accountable." Kennedy simply stared at him, his calm gaze unwavering. He opened the blue binder. The sound of the rings snapping open was like the cocking of a pistol. He began to arrange documents on the table in front of him, each page placed with deliberate, unnerving precision. The soft rustle of paper was the only sound in the vast, silent chamber. "Let's talk about duty," Kennedy said quietly, his eyes on the papers before him. "Let's talk about accountability." He looked up, and the pitying smile had returned to his lips. "And since you've questioned my intelligence, Senator, perhaps you'll do me the courtesy of allowing me to educate myself. Right here, right now." He pulled a thick, bound report from the binder. Its cover was stark white, with the seal of the Department of Justice emblazoned in gold. It was the Durham Report. "Smash that like button and subscribe if you believe in the truth," Kennedy said, his eyes finding the main C-SPAN camera, "because we are about to go through Mr. Schiff's version of it, page by page." The color drained from Adam Schiff's face, leaving a sickly, pale mask of shock. He looked at the report, then at Kennedy's smiling face, and in that moment, he understood. This wasn't a hearing. It was an ambush, and he had walked right into it. The low electronic hum of the committee room's projector coming to life was the only sound. A large screen behind Senator Kennedy, previously dormant, flickered, and then flooded with a brilliant, stark white light, momentarily dazzling the gallery. The room lights dimmed in response, casting long, dramatic shadows across the dais. Then, text appeared on the screen, projected in a font as sharp and unforgiving as a razor's edge. Against a background the color of dried blood, two sentences were juxtaposed. The first was a direct quote, "Schiff, I have seen more than circumstantial evidence of collusion." Below it, a second line, attributed to the Durham Report, finding, "No actual evidence of collusion existed." A collective gasp rippled through the room, a sound of shared shock. It was a direct, brutal contradiction, laid bare for the world to see. Even Schiff's own staff, who had been cheering him on moments before, now stared at the screen, their expressions frozen in disbelief. Kennedy rose from his chair, not with the aggressive posture of Schiff, but with the slow, deliberate movement of a professor approaching a lectern. In his hand, he held a small, black laser pointer. He moved to the side of the screen, the fabric of his suit making no sound, and a tiny, blood-red dot of light appeared on the projected text, hovering like a sniper's sight. "Let us begin with a timeline," Kennedy announced, his Louisiana drawl now imbued with the methodical cadence of a prosecutor laying out his case for the jury. "Let's trace the anatomy of a lie." The red dot moved to the first entry on a timeline that now materialized on the screen. March 20th, 2017. The screen split. On one side, the timeline remained. On the other, a video clip began to play. It was Adam Schiff, younger, his face smooth and confident, sitting across from Chuck Todd on NBC's Meet the Press. The Schiff on the screen looked directly into the camera, his gaze earnest, his voice resonating with absolute conviction. "I can't go into the particulars," the recorded voice of Schiff said, "but I can say that there is more than circumstantial evidence of collusion, and I have seen it." The clip ended, and the screen returned to the stark text. Kennedy's laser pointer was perfectly still on the quote. "More than circumstantial evidence," Kennedy repeated, letting the words hang in the silent room. A very specific claim. Not an opinion, not an interpretation. A statement of fact, presented to millions of Americans as the truth from the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee. The laser dot moved down the timeline. 2 months later, May 2017, CNN. Another clip played. This time, Schiff was with Jake Tapper, his expression even more serious, more resolute. "The case is building," the on-screen Schiff declared, his hands gesturing for emphasis. "The evidence is damning, and the threads are all coming together." The clip ended. Kennedy didn't speak. He simply let the silence amplify the implication. Then the red dot moved again. July 2017, MSNBC. A third clip appeared. Schiff, now looking grave, was speaking with an air of solemn duty. "We are seeing a pattern of behavior that is deeply concerning, and the evidence of coordination is hiding in plain sight." The clips were relentless, a drumbeat of accusation. With each one, the confidence in the room seemed to leak away from Schiff's side of the aisle and gather around Kennedy. The quiet senator from Louisiana was no longer a subject of ridicule. He was a conductor, orchestrating a symphony of his opponent's own words, turning them into a damning chorus. "Point of order, Mr. Chairman!" Schiff's voice was a strangled cry. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Point of order! This is a gross distortion of the record!" Chairman Graham turned his head slowly to look at Schiff. There was no sympathy in his eyes. "Senator Schiff," Graham said, his voice flat and hard, "you had the floor, and you used it to make a number of personal observations. Senator Kennedy has the floor now. He will be heard. Sit down." The command was not a suggestion. It was an order, backed by the full authority of the chairmanship. For a moment, it looked as if Schiff might defy him. He stood trembling, his hands gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles bone white. His jaw worked, but no sound came out. The defiance in his eyes warred with the sudden, dawning realization of his own powerlessness. Finally, with a shuddering breath, he collapsed back into his chair, a low growl of frustration escaping his lips. Kennedy watched the exchange without expression, then turned back to his presentation, as if the interruption had never occurred. The laser dot continued its inexorable march down the timeline. October 2017. ABC, quote, "There is clear evidence of collusion." November 2017. CBS, quote, "The evidence is more than sufficient for any prosecutor to take action." January 2018. CNN again. "Those are taken out of context," Schiff shouted from his seat, unable to stop himself. His voice was shrill. Kennedy stopped the presentation. He turned his full body to face Schiff, a look of mild inquiry on his face. "Out of context?" he asked, his voice soft. "All of them, Senator. All 37 times?" The number landed like a physical blow. 37. The screen behind Kennedy suddenly erupted into a dizzying montage. It was a rapid-fire sequence of Schiff's face, on dozens of different sets, with dozens of different anchors. CNN, MSNBC, ABC, CBS, NBC. The backgrounds changed, the ties changed, the interviewers changed, but the message was brutally, damningly consistent. "I've seen the evidence. More than circumstantial. The case is clear. Damning. Coordination. Collusion occurred." The words overlapped, creating a cacophony of accusation, a hypnotic loop of a single, obsessive idea. The montage lasted for a full, excruciating minute, a compressed summary of 3 years of public pronouncements. When it ended, the screen went black, and the silence that descended was profound. It was the silence of a congregation that has just seen a terrible truth revealed. Then, new text appeared, simple, stark, and official. Mueller Report, March 2019. The investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government. A new slide appeared. Inspector General Horowitz Report, December 2019. 17 significant errors and omissions. No evidence to support probable cause for surveillance. And then the final slide, the capstone of the entire edifice of evidence. Durham Report, May 2023. The FBI had no predicated evidence to open the investigation. The entire premise was false. The Democrats in the gallery were no longer looking at Schiff with admiration. They were looking at their phones, scrolling through news alerts and text messages from the outside world. The story was breaking, and the narrative was not what they had expected. A few rows back, a man in a crisp suit, a senior aide to a Democratic senator, quietly gathered his briefcase, stood up, and walked unobtrusively toward the rear exit. It was the first visible crack in the dam. Kennedy let the final slide remain on the screen as he walked back to his seat. He picked up the physical copy of the Durham Report, its weight seeming to possess a moral as well as a physical gravity. He opened it to a page marked with a yellow tab. "Let me read to you directly from Special Counsel John Durham's findings," he said, his voice calm and clear. Quote, "Neither U.S. law enforcement nor the intelligence community appears to have possessed any actual evidence of collusion in their holdings at the commencement of the Crossfire Hurricane investigation." He looked up from the report, his gaze locking onto Schiff. "Senator, you were the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. You had access to the exact same classified information that Robert Mueller had. You saw precisely what John Durham reviewed. You knew what was in the government's possession, and more importantly, you knew what was not. Kennedy's voice, which had been so measured, hardened almost imperceptibly. And yet, you went on national television, not once, not twice, but 37 times. And you told the American people that you had seen evidence. Evidence that 3 separate, independent, and exhaustive investigations have now proven, beyond any shadow of a doubt, never existed. I had a different interpretation of the intelligence. Schiff's voice was thin, reedy, the voice of a man backed into a corner. It was ambiguous. It was complex. Interpretation? Kennedy cut him off, the word sharp as a shard of glass. You don't interpret a void, Senator. The evidence wasn't ambiguous. It was absent. You weren't interpreting intelligence. You were inventing it. That is a slanderous accusation. Schiff's voice cracked, a desperate attempt to reclaim the moral high ground he had so confidently occupied an hour earlier. It's a lie. Kennedy's expression remained one of placid disappointment. He reached into his blue binder and retrieved another document. It was heavier stock, embossed with the golden seal of the United States House of Representatives. He held it up so the cameras could capture it clearly. H-Res 503, Kennedy announced, his voice tolling like a courtroom bell. June 21st, 2023. A resolution of the House of Representatives to censure you, Senator Schiff, for your conduct. The word censure echoed in the chamber. It was a formal, historical condemnation, a permanent stain. In the gallery, Elena Petrova, the woman whose father had been a political prisoner, whispered the word to herself, understanding its gravity. It was the system turning on one of its own. Let me read from the resolution itself, Kennedy continued, his eyes scanning the page. Quote, whereas Representative Adam Schiff misled the American people, whereas he abused his access to sensitive information, whereas he engaged in conduct unbecoming of an elected member of the House of Representatives, now, therefore, be it resolved that Representative Adam B. Schiff be, and hereby is, censured. He looked up, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces in the gallery before settling back on Schiff. The final vote was 213 to 209. You became only the 25th member in the entire history of the United States Congress to receive that public rebuke. It was a purely partisan exercise, Schiff shot back, grasping at the familiar defense. Political retribution for my role in the impeachment of Donald Trump. Retribution? Kennedy mused, tilting his head. That's a convenient narrative, but let's look closer. He produced a sheaf of printed news articles, clippings from The Hill, Politico, and The New York Times. Before you blame this on your political opponents, let's hear what your own Democratic colleagues said about you, anonymously, of course, after the vote. He began to read the quotes, each one a dagger from a friendly hand. Quote, he went out on a limb with claims he couldn't back up, and he took the rest of us with him. He made us look like fools. Another one from a senior caucus member, quote, we placed our trust in him, our credibility. He squandered it for television time. And a third, quote, his constant grandstanding undermined the party's ability to conduct serious oversight. We lost all credibility. Kennedy placed the articles down on the table, a look of somber pity on his face. These aren't Republicans, Senator. These are your allies, your own party. They said this. They believed you had damaged them, that you had abused their trust. Does that sound like purely partisan retribution to you? Schiff's face, which had been a canvas of red anger and pale shock, now settled into a grim, gray mask. He looked like a man watching his own political obituary being written in real time. The foundation of his defense, that he was a righteous warrior persecuted by his enemies, was crumbling, revealed to be a fiction, even to his friends. Kennedy let the silence linger, allowing the weight of the betrayal to sink in. But let's assume you're right, he said. his tone shifting again, becoming more prosecutorial. Let's assume the censure was just politics. Let's move on from ethical failures and public deception to something more tangible. Let's talk about federal crimes. He reached for a new folder. This one was a startling, vibrant red, the universal color for classified material. The entire room seemed to lean forward as one. The air crackled with a new level of tension. This was no longer about political lies. This was about national security. He opened the folder and pulled out a single form, marked with the unmistakable seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "This," Kennedy said, holding the document carefully, "is an FBI Form 302. It is the official report of a witness interview. This particular 302 documents an interview with a man who served for 10 years as a professional staff member on the House Intelligence Committee. A Democrat, senator, a man who worked for your party, on your committee, for a decade." Schiff's hands, resting on the table before him, began to tremble. It was a small tremor at first, but it grew until it was visible to everyone in the room. He clasped them together, trying to still them, but the shaking continued. "This whistleblower," Kennedy's voice dropped, becoming quiet, confidential, forcing everyone to listen closely, "told the FBI that in early 2017, you, personally, authorized the systematic and illegal leaking of classified information to reporters." The room erupted. An explosion of sound. Shouted questions from the press. Cries of outrage from the few remaining Schiff supporters. Senators on both sides jumping to their feet. Chairman Graham's gavel came down with a series of loud, percussive bangs. "Order! Order in this committee! The senator will be heard." The chaos slowly subsided, replaced by a tense, waiting silence. Through it all, Kennedy had remained perfectly still, waiting for the storm to pass. He looked at Schiff, whose face was now ashen. "The whistleblower stated," Kennedy continued, his voice cutting through the residual murmur, "that you told your staff, and I quote from the FBI report, the leaked information would be used to indict President Trump." The implication was stunning. Not to inform the public, not to expose wrongdoing, but to weaponize classified intelligence to generate a specific, desired political and legal outcome: the indictment of a sitting president. "He said your conduct," Kennedy added, the words falling like stones into a deep well, "was, and I quote again, treasonous." "Lies!" Schiff's voice was a hoarse croak. "He was a disgruntled employee, a fabricator. He was fired for cause." "Was he?" Kennedy interrupted smoothly. "The FBI interviewed this man on 3 separate occasions, in 2017, 2020, and again in 2023 after the Durham report was released. Over 6 years, his testimony never wavered. He provided names, dates, and corroborating evidence, including emails and calendar entries. He named other staffers who could confirm his account. The FBI, in its official assessment, found him to be highly credible." Kennedy paused, then delivered the final, crushing blow. "And we will take a brief 15-minute recess. When we return," he said, pulling another, even thicker folder from his briefcase, this one a plain manila, but ominously labeled in bold black marker, "Mortgage and Tax Fraud, Federal Investigation." "We will discuss how you defrauded the American banking system and the taxpayers of California for over a decade." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Chairman Graham's gavel, coming down one final time. 15 minutes. Schiff sat frozen, his eyes locked on the mortgage fraud folder. It was a tangible object, a symbol of a completely different kind of crime. The Russia narrative could be dismissed as political warfare. The leaks, while serious, were shrouded in the murky world of intelligence and immunity. But mortgage fraud, that was a crime any citizen could understand. It was simple, personal, and deeply sordid. As the room began to empty for the recess, Kennedy gathered his papers with the same methodical calm he had displayed all day. He did not look at Schiff. He didn't have to. The man who had started the hearing with a roar of arrogant fury was now a hollowed-out shell, staring at the ruin of his life, spelled out in the titles of the folders on the table before him. The afternoon was only half over, and Adam Schiff's career was already in ashes. But John Kennedy was not finished with him. Not even close. The 15-minute recess stretched into a tense eternity. In the marbled corridors outside the committee room, a frantic ballet unfolded. Reporters, smelling blood in the water, swarmed any senator or staffer who dared to emerge, peppering them with questions. Democrats, their faces grim, pushed past the cameras, offering clipped no comments before disappearing into the sanctuary of their offices. Republicans, in a rare display of strategic restraint, remained silent, content to let the evidence Kennedy had presented do the talking. Deep within a small, soundproofed office nearby, Adam Schiff sat slumped in a chair, his head in his hands. His chief of staff stood by the door, fielding a relentless barrage of calls and texts, his face a mask of escalating panic. "No, Senator Pelosi. He can't come to the phone right now. Chuck, we'll have to call you back." To the campaign manager, "What the hell do you think is happening? Just tell everyone to stay quiet." Schiff couldn't hear the words. All he could hear was a roaring in his ears. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if he were watching a movie of his own life falling apart. When the committee reconvened, the change in the room was stark. The gallery, once packed to the rafters, was now noticeably emptier, perhaps only 60% full. The boisterous energy of the morning had evaporated, replaced by the somber, voyeuristic curiosity of a crowd at the scene of a terrible accident. Kennedy waited for the room to settle, then began without preamble. Theatrics were no longer necessary. He simply opened the manila folder labeled Mortgage and Tax Fraud. The projector screen, which had been dark, came to life again. It displayed two photographs side by side, a study in contrasts. On the left, a sprawling, handsome brick home in Potomac, Maryland, complete with manicured lawns and a sparkling swimming pool. On the right, a modest, unassuming condominium building in Burbank, California. "Maryland," Kennedy said, his laser pointer indicating the first photograph. A 4-bedroom, 3,120-square-foot house. Current market value, approximately $1.4 million. The red dot moved to the other image. And California. A 1-bedroom, 650-square-foot condominium in your congressional district. Current value, approximately $450,000. Then, stark white text appeared beneath the images. A damning summary. Both properties claimed as primary residence on sworn financial documents 2009-2020. Kennedy turned from the screen to look directly at Schiff. "That, Senator," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight, "is fraud." The room was utterly still. Kennedy pulled a new document from the folder. It bore the letterhead of Fannie Mae. "In 2003, you purchased the home in Maryland for $870,000. To do so, you secured a mortgage backed by the federal government. On your application," he held up a copy of the signed document, Schiff's looping signature clearly visible on the projection. "You signed a legally binding affidavit declaring this property, and, I quote, 'my primary and principal residence.'" He then produced a second mortgage application. 6 years later, in 2009, you purchased the condominium in Burbank, and on this application, you also declared it as your primary residence. This second declaration allowed you to receive a substantial California homeowner's property tax exemption, a benefit reserved exclusively for a person's one and only primary home, an exemption that saved you, by our calculations, around $7,000 per year. The math was simple, the deception self-evident. "Now, Senator," Kennedy continued, adopting the persona of a humble country lawyer, "I'm not a fancy coastal attorney like you, but the law on this seems pretty clear, even to me. You can't have two primary residences. Federal mortgage guidelines and state tax laws are explicit. A primary residence is your true, fixed and permanent home, the place you intend to return to. It is singular. 1. I am required by my duties to maintain residences in both Washington and my district, Schiff protested, his voice weak, a pale shadow of its earlier force. Everyone in Congress does it. Indeed, Kennedy agreed with a nod. Everyone has two homes, a primary home and a secondary home, and the banks and tax authorities have different rules for each. The interest rates are higher on a secondary home. The tax benefits are fewer. Because claiming a property as your primary residence when it is not, in order to secure better financial terms, is a crime. It's called bank fraud. It's called tax fraud. It's stealing, Senator. It's stealing from the banks. It's stealing from the taxpayers, and it's stealing from every honest American who tells the truth on their forms. Kennedy's voice, which had been clinical, suddenly thickened with raw emotion. He took off his glasses and polished them with his handkerchief, a gesture that the room now understood as a sign of deep personal feeling. In 2008, he began, his voice softer, more intimate. My mother lost her home. The political attack had just become deeply personal. The bank foreclosed. They'd given her one of those subprime loans she couldn't really afford. When the financial crisis hit, she got behind. She begged them for a modification, for a little forbearance, a little grace. They said no. He paused, and for a moment, it looked as if he might not be able to continue. The silence in the room was absolute. She was 67 years old. She took on a third job, cleaning offices at night, trying to save that house. It was the only home she'd ever known. He wiped his eyes, a gesture of undisguised grief. She lost it anyway. And you know what, Senator? She only had one home, and she told the truth on every single line of every form she ever filled out. She played by the rules, and the system broke her. He put his glasses back on, his eyes boring into Schiff. And while my mother was working 3 jobs at 67 years old, you were refinancing your Maryland mansion, claiming it as your primary residence to get a lower interest rate, a rate you were not entitled to, a benefit you secured by lying. The moral contrast was devastating. It transcended politics, striking at a core sense of fairness and decency. Even the most cynical reporters in the press gallery looked down at their keyboards, momentarily silenced. Kennedy pressed his advantage, returning to the evidence. Between 2009 and 2020, you refinanced that Maryland property 4 separate times. In 2009, 2011, 2012, and again in 2013. Each time, you signed a sworn affidavit declaring it was your primary residence. Each time, that was a lie. And each time, you received more favorable terms than an honest applicant would have. He pulled another letter from the folder. This is a criminal referral from the director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, the agency that oversees Fannie Mae. It is addressed to the Attorney General, and it is dated 3 months ago. He began to read from it. It has come to our attention that Mr. Adam B. Schiff has, in multiple instances, falsified bank documents and property records to acquire more favorable loan terms. Our analysis concludes that this conduct represents a potential violation of multiple federal statutes, including wire fraud, mail fraud, and bank fraud. This is a political witch hunt, Schiff cried out, his voice cracking. The FHFA director is a Trump appointee, an appointee that you voted to confirm, Senator. Kennedy shot back without missing a beat. The Senate confirmed him with broad bipartisan support. You yourself voted yay. Did you think he was a partisan hack then? Schiff had no answer. He slumped in his chair, defeated. The truth of Kennedy's point was undeniable. He had walked straight into another perfectly laid trap. One more thing, Kennedy said, his voice dropping again. Federal law requires members of Congress to disclose all financial liabilities over $10,000 on their annual disclosure forms. You bought the Maryland home in 2003. You failed to disclose that mortgage to the public and the Ethics Committee for 8 years. You bought the California condo in 2009. You failed to disclose that mortgage for 2 years. You were fined for this failure in 2012, which proves you knew the rules. You simply chose to ignore them. Kennedy stacked the mortgage documents into a neat pile. So, let's summarize. We have a 3-year campaign of lies about Russia, a systematic operation to leak classified intelligence, and a decade-long scheme to commit mortgage and tax fraud. He reached back into his briefcase and pulled out the thickest folder yet, a massive 4-inch-thick binder, bristling with colored tabs. "But this," he said, placing it on the table with a heavy thud that echoed through the silent room, "this shows the true pattern of your career. This file documents your entire tenure in public service. Let's talk about your legacy, Senator Schiff." 4 large television screens, previously dark, flickered to life around the committee room. They were positioned strategically, one behind the dais, one on each side wall, and one at the back of the gallery, creating an immersive 360-degree panorama of failure. Adam Schiff was now physically encircled by the evidence of his own downfall. There was nowhere to look without being confronted by a monument to his disgrace. Screen 1 glowed with the stark official text: "Censured by U.S. House of Representatives, June 2023. Screen 2. Blocked from House Intelligence Committee, January 2023. Screen 3. Ethics Committee investigation, ongoing. Screen 4, the most chilling of all, DOJ criminal referral, May 2025. Schiff's head swiveled from one screen to the next, his expression that of a trapped animal. The room, which had been a forum for his ambition, had been transformed into a prison of his own making. Kennedy remained standing at the podium, his voice now calm and steady, the voice of a historian reciting facts. "House Resolution 503, he began, gesturing to the first screen. "As we've established, you were censured by your colleagues. At the time, you dismissed it as a badge of honor. You called it political theater." He paused, his eyes locking onto Schiff. "Does it still feel like theater, Senator? Are you still proud of that badge?" The vote breakdown appeared on the screen. 213-209. "Every single Republican voted to censure you," Kennedy said. "But that was expected. What wasn't expected were the 4 Democrats who broke ranks to join them. And more telling," he held up the news clippings again, "were the dozens of your own party members who told reporters anonymously what they truly thought. He made us look like fools. He abused our trust. His grandstanding damaged the party. These were your allies, Senator. The people who sat in caucus with you, who worked with you, who should have been defending you. But they couldn't, because they knew you had lied." Before Schiff could formulate a response, a new voice cut through the silence. It was a voice aged by time, but fortified by conviction. From the gallery, an elderly African-American man was slowly getting to his feet, leaning heavily on a dark, hand-carved wooden cane. He wore a simple but dignified suit, and pinned to his lapel were badges from the 1965 Selma to Montgomery marches. Faint scars, pale against his dark skin, were visible on his forearms. "I have something I wish to say," the man announced, his voice resonating with an authority that had nothing to do with elected office. Security officers immediately started moving toward him, but Kennedy raised a hand, stopping them in their tracks. "Please, sir," Kennedy said, his tone one of deep respect. "The committee would be honored to hear from you." Chairman Graham, looking at the man's dignified bearing, nodded his assent. "Please state your name for the record." "My name is James Wright," the man said, his voice clear and strong. "I was a field organizer with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. On March 7, 1965, a day some of you might have read about, Bloody Sunday, I marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, alongside John Lewis. The room fell into a profound hush. This was not a political operative or a random citizen. This was living history. I was beaten by state troopers with billy clubs," Wright continued, his voice steady, "and I was bitten by police dogs. He held up a scarred forearm for the room to see. I spent 12 days in a county hospital and 6 months in a county jail, all for the crime of demanding the right to vote. We endured that. We bled for that, so that men like you—" He pointed his cane directly at Adam Schiff, the tip quivering with emotion, "could one day walk these halls of power without fear." Every eye in the room was fixed on Wright. Even the reporters had stopped typing, their faces rapt. "And you have dishonored everything we fought for." Wright's voice rose, filled with a righteous anger that had been simmering for 60 years. "You took the tools of the state, the very agencies of power we fought to reform, and you corrupted them. You weaponized the FBI, the same FBI that spied on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the same FBI that tried to blackmail him into silence, the same FBI that drove good people to despair. We fought to bring that power into the light, and you dragged it back into the shadows to serve your own ambition." Tears were now streaming freely down James Wright's face, but his voice did not break. "You lied to the American people day after day, while wrapping yourself in the language of justice. You stole from the taxpayers while pretending to be a champion of the common man. You used the legacy of the civil rights movement as a shield to hide your own crimes." He struck the floor with the base of his cane. The sharp thwack echoed in the silent chamber like a judge's gavel. "Shame on you, Senator Schiff," he declared, his voice booming. "Shame on all that you have become." Without another word, Wright turned and began to walk slowly toward the exit. The only sound was the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his cane on the marble floor. It was the sound of a moral verdict being rendered, a judgment from which there was no appeal. When the door finally closed behind him, the silence he left in his wake was heavy and complete. Even Schiff, for the first time all day, seemed genuinely shaken, a single tear tracing a path down his ashen cheek. Kennedy waited a full minute before speaking, a silent tribute to the power of Wright's testimony. When he finally continued, his voice was subdued. "The media," he said simply, gesturing to a new screen. Statistics appeared. "During the Mueller investigation, CNN hosted you for 51 appearances, MSNBC 47 times. The three major networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, gave you a combined 38 interviews. That is 136 appearances where you claimed, unchallenged, to have seen evidence of collusion." A montage of clips played, but this time it was different. It showed fawning interviewers, Jake Tapper nodding along, Rachel Maddow looking at Schiff with undisguised admiration, Chuck Todd failing to ask a single critical follow-up question. "They didn't just report your claims," Kennedy narrated. "They amplified them. They validated them. They made you a star based on a narrative they desperately wanted to be true. They became your partners. And when the Durham report proved you had lied, when the House censured you, when the whistleblower's testimony emerged, they buried the story." Page A17. A 2-minute segment at the end of the hour. Because to admit you were a fraud would be to admit they were your willing accomplices. He looked up from his notes. "A free press is the guardian of democracy. But when the press becomes a willing participant in political deception, it betrays its sacred trust just as surely as you betrayed your oath of office." He paused, then picked up one final document. "Senator Schiff, I want to be very clear about what is happening as we sit in this room. As of this morning, there are 2 federal grand juries actively hearing evidence against you. One in the state of Maryland is examining the evidence of mortgage fraud. A second, in the Eastern District of Virginia, is hearing testimony on the illegal leaking of classified information that may not be protected by congressional immunity." Schiff's head snapped up. The color drained completely from his face. This was no longer theoretical. "Attorney General Bondi has appointed a special counsel, Ed Martin, to oversee both investigations," Kennedy continued, his voice cold and factual. "He met with the director of the FHFA 3 days ago. Your bank records have been subpoenaed. Your phone records have been obtained. Your former staffers are being brought in, one by one, to testify under oath. He looked directly at Schiff, his gaze devoid of all pity. This is not speculation, Senator. This is not political theater. This is prosecution. The only question left to be answered is not whether you will be indicted, but on how many counts. The timeline on the screen updated with a final chilling entry. Expected indictments. October-November 2025. Justice, Kennedy said quietly, is coming, Senator. It may have been delayed, but it will not be denied. Kennedy's voice, which had been cold and prosecutorial, softened one last time. He took off his glasses again, not with the weary anger he had shown when speaking of his mother, but with a profound and heavy sadness. He looked at Schiff, not as a political opponent, but as a man who was about to receive a final, terrible judgment. "You asked me earlier, Senator," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "why I was taking this so personally. I told you about my mother and her home, but that was only part of the story." He reached into the red classified folder, but this time he did not pull out an FBI report or a legal document. He pulled out a single 8x10 glossy photograph. He held it up for the cameras and for the entire room to see. In the front row, Elena Petrova gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. It was the same photograph she wore pinned to her dress. It was the face of her father. No, wait. The script is about Maria Gonzalez and her son. Let me correct the narrative to align with the established characters. Kennedy's voice, which had been cold and prosecutorial, softened one last time. He took off his glasses again, not with the weary anger he had shown when speaking of his mother, but with a profound and heavy sadness. He looked at Schiff, not as a political opponent, but as a man who was about to receive a final, terrible judgment. "You asked me earlier, Senator," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "why I was taking this so personally. I told you about my mother and her home, but that was only part of the story." He reached into the red classified folder, but this time he did not pull out an FBI report or a legal document. He pulled out a single 8x10 glossy photograph. He held it up for the cameras and for the entire room to see. In the front row, Maria Gonzalez, the woman in the black dress, let out a strangled sob. It was the photograph of her son. "This," Kennedy said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide, "was Marine Lieutenant Marcus Gonzalez. He was 24 years old. He was killed in action in Afghanistan in October of 2018. He placed the photograph gently on the table, facing Schiff, so that the smiling face of the young Marine was the only thing the senator could see. The room was so quiet that the sound of Maria Gonzalez's weeping was audible in every corner. "There was an intelligence breach," Kennedy continued, his voice low and devastating. "Classified information regarding troop movements was compromised. Lieutenant Gonzalez's unit was sent on a patrol based on intelligence that the enemy already possessed. They walked into a perfectly planned, perfectly executed ambush. Marcus and 4 other American Marines died that day." He paused, letting the horror of the statement settle. Subsequent investigations by military intelligence traced the likely origin of that leak back to Washington, D.C., specifically to a series of unauthorized disclosures originating from the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. He looked at Schiff, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "The time frame of the leak, Senator, falls directly within the period that your own staffer described as your systematic leak operation. The same operation you authorized. The same operation you used to feed stories to the press. The implication was monstrous. It hung in the air, unspoken, but understood by everyone. The leaks were not just about political advantage anymore. They were about life and death. Now, do we know for certain that it was your leak that killed Marcus Gonzalez?" Kennedy said, his voice dropping even lower. "No, we don't have a signed confession. The trail goes cold in the back alleys of anonymous sources and deep background conversations that you perfected. But the possibility is there. The connection is there. The blood is on the table. He gestured toward the photograph of the smiling Marine. Maria Gonzalez was now sobbing openly, her shoulders shaking with a grief that was raw and new all over again. In that moment, the entire political drama, the lies, the censure, the fraud, all of it seemed to shrink, dwarfed by this one terrible human cost. His mother, Mrs. Gonzalez, who has sat here all day listening to you, wrote to my office 3 times, Kennedy said, his voice trembling with a barely controlled rage. She sent me this photograph. She didn't want politics. She just wanted to know why her son died. She wanted someone, anyone, to be held accountable. He looked away from Schiff, and his gaze found Maria Gonzalez in the front row. That's why I'm here today, Senator, he said, his voice now directed as much to her as it was to Schiff. Not for politics, not for partisan advantage, not for revenge, but for her, for Marcus, for every American you lied to, for every institution you corrupted, and for every person whose life was damaged by your insatiable ambition. The room was a wreck. The carefully constructed facades of political decorum had been completely shattered. Republicans and Democrats alike were visibly moved, their faces etched with horror and pity. Reporters sat stunned, the sheer gravity of the accusation overwhelming their professional cynicism. Even Adam Schiff, the man at the center of the storm, was finally completely broken. He was weeping, not the single silent tear of before, but racking, agonizing sobs, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders heaving. Kennedy stood for a long moment, watching the man he had just destroyed. Then, with a quiet finality, he began to gather his papers, stacking them into neat, orderly piles. "I am finished, Mr. Chairman," he announced, his voice regaining its composure. He buttoned his suit jacket, turned, and began to walk toward the main exit of the committee room. "Wait!" The voice was a desperate, broken cry. Schiff's head shot up, his face streaked with tears, his eyes wild with panic. "Kennedy, wait!" Kennedy paused at the door, but did not turn around. I can explain," Schiff stammered, his words tumbling out, incoherent with desperation. "There are things, context, you don't understand." Kennedy stood with his back to him, a silhouette against the bright light of the hallway. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, devoid of anger or triumph, filled only with a cold, empty finality. "Explain it to the grand jury, Senator." He paused for a beat. "Explain it to Maria Gonzalez." Then, after another heart-stopping silence, he added the final, devastating blow. "Explain it to Marcus." The door swung shut behind him with a soft, almost silent click, leaving Adam Schiff utterly alone at the witness table. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every detail of his complete and public annihilation. Chairman Graham looked down at the broken man, then at the empty chair where Kennedy had sat. He lifted his gavel, and with a single, sharp crack, brought the proceedings to a close. "This hearing," he declared to the mostly empty room, "is adjourned." But for Adam Schiff, the real judgment was only just beginning. The committee room emptied with the somber, hushed reverence of a funeral parlor. The usual post-hearing cacophony of reporters shouting questions and senators giving competing spins to the cameras was absent. There was nothing left to spin. Democrats, their faces ashen, slipped out through side exits, avoiding all eye contact, desperate to distance themselves from the political carnage. Republicans filed out quietly, their victory so absolute that any form of celebration would have seemed crass. They had witnessed not just a political defeat, but a public execution, and the solemnity of the moment seemed to affect them all. Adam Schiff remained at the witness table, a solitary figure in the cavernous, empty room. He was motionless, staring at the spot where the photograph of Marcus Gonzalez had been. He felt a profound numbness, a sensory deprivation that insulated him from the full scope of the catastrophe. It was as if his mind, in an act of self-preservation, had refused to process the final devastating blow. "Senator." The voice was a timid whisper. His chief of staff was crouching beside him, his face pale, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "Senator, we have to go. They need to clear the room for the next hearing." Schiff heard the words, but they didn't register. He tried to push his chair back, to stand up, but his legs would not obey. A strange, debilitating weakness had settled deep in his limbs, a potent combination of physical exhaustion and profound psychological shock. "I can't," Schiff murmured, the words barely audible. "I can't stand." His aide's face, already a mask of stress, tightened with a new wave of panic. He looked toward the main door and gave a subtle, desperate signal. Two uniformed Capitol Police officers, who had been standing by, approached the table with professional neutrality. "Senator, can we assist you?" one asked, his voice polite but firm. Schiff simply nodded, a gesture of complete surrender. Each officer took an arm, and with a gentle but firm grip, they lifted him to his feet. He was unsteady, his weight sagging between them. The few remaining photographers in the press gallery, who had lingered for this very moment, raised their cameras. The shutters clicked in a relentless, predatory chorus, capturing the humiliating image. The once powerful chairman, the feared prosecutor of a president, being supported like an invalid, his face a vacant mask of defeat. On the table he left behind, his smartphone lay screen up. The screen was a waterfall of notifications, a cascading torrent of political abandonment. 147 missed calls. Texts scrolled by faster than the eye could read them. "Nancy Pelosi, do not speak to anyone. Call me, Chuck Schumer. We have a serious problem. Campaign manager, we are hemorrhaging donors. All fundraising events canceled." Then, a stream of messages from colleagues, friends, and allies, each a small, sharp stab of betrayal. "Sorry, can't help you with this. No comment." Going dark for a while. The gauntlet of reporters waiting in the hallway was a chaotic wall of noise and flashing lights. The questions came like shrapnel. "Senator, will you resign? Did you leak the information that led to the death of a Marine? Are the mortgage fraud allegations true? Will you plead guilty to the grand jury?" Schiff's mouth moved, a dry, silent gaping. He looked like a fish pulled from the water, drowning in the air. His aide, now acting as a human shield, pushed forward, repeating a frantic mantra. "No comment at this time. The senator has no comment." So, they broke through the scrum and reached the Grand Rotunda, heading for the east entrance where his official car was supposed to be waiting. It wasn't there. The aide spoke frantically into his phone. "Where is he?" "The senator is waiting." The voice on the other end was cold, official. "The vehicle has been recalled, pending review. The driver is unavailable." Even the institutional perks of power were being stripped away, in real time, abandoned. A sitting United States senator, disgraced and defeated, was left standing on the curb like any other citizen. Schiff had to call an Uber. The 5-minute wait felt like an hour. He stood, flanked by the two officers, a small, pathetic island in a sea of gawking tourists and circling protesters who had already heard the news. The signs were hastily made, but brutal. "Liar. Justice for Marcus. Schiff for prison." An elderly woman with a Veterans for Trump hat broke through the police line, her face contorted with rage. "I have 2 sons who served," she screamed, her voice cracking. "You put a target on their backs. You traitor." When the black sedan finally pulled up, the driver, a young man with an earpiece, glanced at him and did a double-take. "Whoa," he breathed. "You're that guy. The guy from the TV." Schiff said nothing, collapsing into the back seat, the leather cool against his skin. He stared out the window as a light rain began to fall, the drops streaking down the glass like tears. The driver, sensing the mood, turned on the radio. It was a news station. Kennedy's voice filled the car, calm and measured, followed by the sound of James Wright's cane tapping on the marble floor. Schiff flinched as if struck. "Can you turn that off?" he whispered. The driver complied, and the rest of the ride passed in a heavy, suffocating silence. Meanwhile, miles away in his own quiet Senate office, John Kennedy sat alone. His jacket was off, his tie was loosened, and the immense fatigue of the day was etched on his face. The 9-hour hearing, the months of preparation, the emotional toll of the confrontation, it all settled on him at once. His phone buzzed incessantly on the desk, a constant stream of texts and calls from Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, from colleagues offering congratulations. He ignored them all. This had never been about a victory lap. On his desk, he had placed the 3 letters Maria Gonzalez had sent him. Next to them lay the faded photograph of his own mother. He looked from one to the other, a quiet reckoning playing out in his own mind. Had he done the right thing? Or had he simply weaponized one family's tragedy to destroy a political enemy? His private line rang, bypassing his staff. He picked it up. "Mrs. Gonzalez," he said, his voice soft. "It's John Kennedy." On the other end of the line he could hear her weeping, a sound not of pure grief, but of a terrible, cathartic release. "They said his name," she sobbed. "You made them all say his name." "Yes, ma'am," Kennedy said quietly. "We did. His service mattered. His sacrifice was honored today. And someone is being held accountable." They spoke for a few more minutes. When he hung up, Kennedy did not feel triumphant. He felt only the quiet, somber weight of a duty fulfilled. He opened a lower desk drawer and pulled out another set of files, another thick binder filled with whistleblower reports and financial documents, this one bearing the name of a different public official. He sighed. The work was never done. This was just one battle in a much, much longer war. 1 week later, Adam Schiff was a ghost, haunting the rooms of his own life. He had fled Washington, taking refuge in his California home. But there was no sanctuary to be found. The house, once a symbol of his success, had become a luxurious prison. For 3 days, he didn't step outside. A small, persistent group of protesters kept a vigil on the sidewalk, their signs a constant, silent accusation. The professional destruction had been swift and merciless, executed with the cold precision of a guillotine. The Senate Democratic Caucus, in a move framed as a temporary measure, had voted to suspend his committee assignments pending the outcome of the ethics investigation. Everyone in Washington understood the code. He was being stripped of all power, cast out from the inner circle. His access to the intelligence briefings that had been the source of his authority was revoked. He was now just a man with a vote, a pariah his colleagues avoided in the hallways. His staff, the loyal foot soldiers of his political army, were abandoning the field. 3 of his most senior aides, including the chief of staff who had helped him from the hearing room, had resigned. Their departure announced in terse, carefully worded statements that offered no words of support. 4 others had conspicuously updated their LinkedIn profiles, their availability for new opportunities, a public declaration of desertion. One, a young communications aide, had given an anonymous, on-the-record interview to Politico, meticulously detailing how he had been kept in the dark about the full context of the Russia claims, a desperate act of career self-preservation. The financial lifeblood of his political operation had been severed. Campaign donors, from wealthy tech executives to small-dollar grassroots supporters, were not just closing their checkbooks, they were demanding refunds. The campaign's email servers were hemorrhaging subscribers at a rate of thousands per hour. His lucrative speaking engagements, a source of significant personal income, had all been canceled. His book publisher, citing a material change in circumstance clause in his contract, had put his upcoming memoir on indefinite hold, a polite fiction for its inevitable cancellation. But the professional consequences, as devastating as they were, felt distant and abstract compared to the suffocating reality of his legal peril. His days were now structured around frantic meetings with a team of high-priced defense attorneys. They sat in his spacious living room, the California sun streaming through the windows, and spoke of plea deals, sentencing guidelines, and the political leanings of federal judges in Maryland and Virginia. Every option was a different shade of ruin. "The evidence on the mortgage fraud is overwhelming," his lead counsel, a grim-faced former prosecutor, had told him that morning. "The signed affidavits are a confession, Adam. Our only play is to argue it was a common, technical mistake, not criminal intent. It's a weak argument." On the classified leaks, the situation was even more dire. The whistleblower's testimony, corroborated by the second staffer, David Chen, is damning, another lawyer explained. "Your only real protection is the speech or debate clause, but the special counsel will argue that authorizing a systematic leak operation falls outside the scope of legitimate legislative activity. If a judge agrees, you are exposed. Completely." The grand juries were meeting. Subpoenas had flown out from the Department of Justice like confetti. His bank records, his travel receipts, his personal emails, his text messages, his entire life was being dissected by federal investigators. Former staffers were being compelled to testify, one by one. The walls were not just closing in, they were already touching his shoulders. The personal toll was, perhaps, the most profound. His wife, who had stood by him through decades of political battles, was now a stranger in their own home. She spoke to him in clipped monosyllabic sentences, her face a permanent mask of strained disappointment. The strain had become a chasm between them, and for the past 4 nights she had slept in the guest room. His 2 children, both adults with their own lives, called, but their conversations were stilted and awkward, filled with long, painful silences. They didn't know what to say. How do you ask your father if he is going to prison? Friends he had known since law school, men he had vacationed with, had gone silent. Their calls went to voicemail. Their texts went unanswered. Only one, a college roommate who now worked as a public defender, called every day. He didn't ask about the case. He just asked, "Adam, how are you sleeping?" He wasn't. He had lost 12 pounds in a week, his appetite gone. When exhaustion finally claimed him, his sleep was a fever dream of echoing gavels, weeping mothers, and the tapping of an old man's cane. His doctor had prescribed a strong sedative, but it only pulled him into a thick, dreamless fog from which he awoke feeling even more exhausted. He spent his days in his home office, the television on, but the sound muted. The cable news channels played the hearing on a loop. He watched it obsessively, a form of self-flagellation. He saw himself that morning, puffed up with arrogance, hurling insults at Kennedy. The man on the screen seemed like a different person, a deluded fool from another lifetime. He couldn't reconcile that man with the hollowed-out shell he now saw in the mirror. His laptop was open to a news aggregator. The headlines were a relentless assault. Schiff's collapse. A Greek tragedy in real time. Media reckoning. How reporters became complicit in the Schiff deception. California Democrats scrambled to distance themselves from embattled senator. Grand juries. Active. Indictment of Schiff, now seen as inevitable. His phone, which had exploded with messages of abandonment on the day of the hearing, was now mostly silent. The silence was worse than the anger. It was the silence of the politically dead. The powerful people who had once courted his favor, governors, cabinet secretaries, party leaders, had moved on. He was no longer a player. He was a liability. He was yesterday's news. The silence from the party leadership was the most damning judgment of all. It was a calculated, strategic silence, more eloquent than any public condemnation. Governor Newsom of California, a man with whom Schiff had once shared cigars and fundraising strategies, issued a terse, one-sentence statement through a spokesperson. The legal process must be allowed to play out. In the brutal calculus of politics, it was a disavowal. Nancy Pelosi, the woman who had been his most powerful mentor and champion, who had entrusted him with the solemn duty of leading a presidential impeachment, was asked about him by a reporter in a Capitol hallway. She paused, her expression unreadable, and said only, "Adam is a longtime public servant. He now needs to reflect on what is best for the country and for the party." It was a political eulogy. The translation was clear to everyone in Washington. Resign. Fall on your sword. Do not let your personal scandal drag the rest of us down with you. He was no longer an asset. He was a contagion. The party apparatus, which had once amplified his every word, was now working diligently to scrub his presence from its history. His image was quietly removed from the party's website. Scheduled fundraising emails bearing his signature were pulled. A planned appearance at the state party convention was canceled, attributed to a scheduling conflict. He was being systematically erased. In his darkened office, Schiff read these signals with the practiced eye of a lifelong politician. He understood the cold, transactional nature of the world he had inhabited. He had seen it happen to others. He had, on occasion, participated in the shunning of a colleague whose political toxicity had become too great. He just never imagined it would happen to him. He felt a surge of bitter resentment. Where were the defenders? Where were the allies who had cheered him on as he took on Trump? They had used him. They had celebrated his attacks, basked in the glow of his media stardom, and now that he was wounded, the pack was turning on him, leaving him for dead. He was 65 years old. He had been a United States Senator for less than 2 years, a position he had coveted his entire life, the culmination of a long, steady climb. Now, it was all over. His legacy would not be the impeachment he had so proudly led. His legacy would be this: corruption, censure, and criminality. His name would become a cautionary tale, a synonym for hubris and downfall. His freedom itself was no longer a certainty. The phrase, federal sentencing guidelines, had become a recurring motif in his nightmares. He sat in the dark, the only light coming from the muted television screen, where a panel of pundits was dissecting his career, speaking of him in the past tense. He was a living ghost, watching his own autopsy. Meanwhile, across the country, John Kennedy maintained a disciplined public silence. He declined every invitation to appear on the Sunday morning news shows. He did not give interviews. He did not issue triumphant press releases. When a reporter caught him outside the Senate chamber and asked if he felt vindicated, Kennedy simply adjusted his glasses and said, "The evidence speaks for itself. The committee's work is done. Now it's a matter for the Department of Justice. I'm focused on the appropriations bill." This refusal to gloat was, in its own way, the most devastating blow. It framed his actions not as a personal vendetta or a political victory, but as a solemn, necessary, and unpleasant duty. It robbed Schiff of his last remaining defense, that he was the victim of a political rival. Kennedy's quiet focus on the next piece of legislative business made Schiff's drama seem like a tawdry sideshow, already receding into the past. Kennedy's office released only one public statement, a short letter addressed to the chairman of the Senate Ethics Committee, formally submitting the evidence presented in the hearing and requesting a full investigation into Senator Schiff's conduct. It was a simple, procedural act, but it was another nail in the coffin. He was not just letting the legal process play out, he was ensuring it would. That evening, Schiff sat alone, his uneaten dinner cold on the plate beside him. He scrolled through his phone, not at the news, but at old photographs, pictures of his law school graduation, his wedding day, the day he was first sworn into Congress, his children beside him, their faces beaming with pride. A life of ambition, of service, of carefully constructed respectability. It all seemed like a fiction now. He thought of the man he had been that morning, just 1 week ago, the righteous fury, The absolute certainty, the intoxicating feeling of power as he stood to attack John Kennedy. He had called him a backwards Louisiana hillbilly in cheap glasses. The memory of his own words made him physically ill. It felt like a lifetime ago. Now, he finally understood. Kennedy's calm had not been weakness. It had been strength. His folksy demeanor had not been ignorance. It had been a mask. While Schiff had been chasing headlines and basking in the adulation of cable news hosts, Kennedy had been doing the work. He had been gathering facts, collecting evidence, and building a case with the patient. Methodical precision of a master prosecutor. Schiff had brought a knife to a gunfight and had only realized it when the bullets were already tearing through him. The reckoning had come, and there was no escaping the judgment. 2 weeks after the hearing, on a Tuesday morning, Adam Schiff walked into his home office, a room he now associated with dread and isolation, and closed the door. He was wearing a perfectly tailored suit, the kind he would have worn to a Senate vote or a television appearance. It was an armor he no longer needed, but he wore it out of habit, a final nod to the man he used to be. For the first time in days, his face was clean-shaven, and his hair was perfectly combed. The physical exhaustion was still there, etched in the deep lines around his eyes, but a new, grim resolve had settled over him. He sat at his large mahogany desk and placed a single sheet of paper before him. It was a letter, addressed to the governor of California. He had written it late the night before, after his lawyers had delivered their final, unvarnished assessment. Indictment was not a possibility, but a certainty. Likely on multiple counts, across 2 federal jurisdictions. A trial, they had warned, would be a protracted, humiliating spectacle with a very high probability of conviction and a lengthy prison sentence. A plea bargain was his only path to mitigating the utter destruction of his remaining years. He picked up a pen, the same expensive fountain pen he had used to sign legislation, and with a hand that was surprisingly steady, he affixed his signature to the bottom of the page. The letter contained a single, stark sentence. Effective immediately, I hereby resign my seat in the United States Senate. The act was anticlimactic. There was no thunderclap, no sudden release, just the quiet scratch of a pen on paper. He then turned to a second piece of paper. This was a public statement, drafted by the remnants of his communications team. It was a masterpiece of political euphemism, speaking of the need to avoid a prolonged and distracting political battle, and his desire to focus on his family and legal challenges. It contained no admission of guilt, no apology. It was the last defiant gasp of a political animal. He emailed both documents to his attorney for distribution and then shut his laptop. The silence that filled the room was absolute. It was over. His phone, which had been his lifeline and his tormentor, lay dark on the desk. He felt no desire to turn it on. The torrent of news alerts, the opinions of pundits, the condemnations of his enemies and the silence of his friends, none of it mattered anymore. He was no longer Senator Schiff. He was just Adam Schiff, a private citizen facing federal indictment. He thought, with a strange sense of detachment, about John Kennedy. He pictured him in his office, poring over another set of files, methodically preparing his next case. Kennedy had not destroyed him with a single, brilliant attack. He had simply held up a mirror and allowed Schiff's own words, his own actions, and his own arrogance to do the work. The fatal blow had not come from Kennedy's hand. It had come from within. The hubris that had propelled him to the heights of power had been the same force that had guaranteed his fall. He had become so enamored with the sound of his own voice, so convinced of his own righteousness, that he had forgotten the first rule of combat: know your enemy. He had underestimated the quiet man from Louisiana. He had dismissed him as a folksy caricature, a political lightweight. He had failed to see the surgeon's steady hand, the prosecutor's sharp mind, and the deep, abiding anger that lay beneath the calm exterior. He had poked a bear he thought was sleeping, and it had torn him to pieces. Outside, the California sun was bright, but the blinds in his office were drawn shut, casting the room in a perpetual twilight. He sat in the darkness for a long time, a man out of time, a king without a kingdom, waiting for the sound of a doorbell that would signal the arrival of the next phase of his new life, the service of a subpoena, the beginning of his long, slow walk toward judgment. The cost of betraying the public trust, he had learned far too late, was the forfeiture of his own future. The quiet ones, the ones who let the evidence speak for them, are often the most dangerous opponents of all. The reckoning had come, and it was final. The story of Adam Schiff and John Kennedy is more than just a political drama. It is a timeless lesson in power, arrogance, and accountability. It serves as a stark reminder that in the arena of public life, the truth, however long it is buried, will eventually find its way into the light. And when that light shines, it can be unforgiving. If you believe that no one should be above the law and that the truth must always prevail, show your support by liking this video, subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the corridors of power, and sharing this story with others who value integrity and justice.